Welcome to this short video on completing assessment forms on Practice Placement C. Assessment forms are generally completed fortnightly, and their completion is really very straightforward, where the student will draft their sections and submit the form to all practice educators involved in that rotation about 1 working day before the meeting to discuss the form. In this working day, the practice educators complete their sections of the form, and the fully drafted form is then discussed by the student and practice educator. The form, once discussed, is signed off by the student and practice educator. When drafting the form and assessing each proficiency, it's important to use the documentation in the placement portfolio, such as the patient cases and reflection logs, as evidence to support assigning a yes, a no, or not applicable to each proficiency. When deciding upon whether or not to assign a yes to a proficiency, you can ask yourself this question. If you were to imagine that the student is to start their first day of work as a qualified dietitian tomorrow, would you say that the student is demonstrating the proficiency to a safe, competent, and professional standard that's required of a qualified practitioner? Bear in mind that on anybody's first day of work, there are always going to be minor inefficiencies, but they should only be minor. And so this is the standard against which each proficiency is assessed throughout the entirety of placement. If your answer to this question is yes or no, then that's what goes on the form. If you've insufficient evidence to support a yes or a no, then not applicable must be documented on the form. The mapping document on dietitian.ie can be used to help assign proficiencies, as it provides an approximate indication of when each proficiency is expected to emerge on placement. Alongside the fortnightly assessment forms, a once-off midpoint review is completed at some point between weeks 6 and 8 of placement. It's a short 20-minute meeting that takes place between the student coordinator, tutor, and student. Practice educators that are involved in training and assessing the student prior to this review are not involved in this meeting in any way. Practice educators will have already contributed to assessment forms, and so their view of student progress has already been documented and it's not needed again. So they are not needed for this review. This review is to ensure that the student coordinator and tutor hold the same view of student progress. And it also gives the student a chance to answer questions at this particularly critical point of placement. So effectively, the midpoint review is an additional safety net alongside the assessment forms to ensure that any issues identified with student progress are addressed in as timely a fashion as possible. So if we have a quick look at these 2 forms of assessment on dietitian.ie, you'll see here under the assessment tab that there are blank assessment forms and midpoint review forms. There are also sample completed forms here. And if we have a look at a sample completed assessment form, the student will obviously draft this initial part of the first page. And then throughout the form, the student will assign themselves a yes, a no, or not applicable, indicating whether or not they feel they have assessed or achieved rather each proficiency. In addition to completing the column, where indicated, the student will also provide evidence to support their progress, usually with proficiencies that may not have evidence or as much evidence through other forms of documentation like patient cases or reflection logs. So the student will complete their sections indicated and then submit the form to their practice educators, who should then, when they're drafting the form, assess each proficiency, so assign a yes or a no to each proficiency and complete the boxes indicated for them. It's important within these boxes where you're commenting on student performance or providing suggestions where students can improve their performance, that you may provide a comment on student performance, but it's also important to provide context to your comment. So for example, if we look here in domain 3, which looks at a lot of clinical skills and knowledge, a comment may be made around an area that the student needs to work on. So for example, that more attention is needed on identifying and recording nutrition-focused physical findings. It's really important that you provide examples that put this comment into context, because the examples that you provide will help indicate the degree of deficit with that proficiency. So for example, is the deficit quite minimal, where the student just needs to make a few minor tweaks and they're very close to getting a yes? Or are the examples you're providing indicative of the deficit being quite significant and the student needs to very much focus on that proficiency in their next rotation? So you can provide constructive feedback on what you want the student to improve on, but always accompany this with context and clear examples of that should indicate the degree of urgency around the student needing to improve that proficiency. Once you draft, as a practice educator, once you draft your columns and the boxes that are set aside for practice educator input, then there's space on the back page for any additional comments, or if you've run out of space in any of the other boxes above, that you can put comments here on the back page. Once the student and practice educators have drafted their respective parts of the form, the practice educator and student meet to discuss the form. The proficiencies where the student and practice educator are perhaps very much on the same page and won't need much discussion, but where there are proficiencies where there was a difference in how this proficiency has been assessed, it's useful to discuss these. The student should never change their assessment of their proficiency to what the practice educator has said. It should remain as was drafted, but it's a point for discussion. Once the form has been discussed throughout, the student and practice educator should identify areas that require attention in the next rotation on placement. And so a couple of key areas should be identified and recorded here, and then the form should be signed off and the student uploads it to their placement portfolio. So that's the assessment form, and there is a short one-page guide in the checklist section on completing assessment forms here. So it's this short one-pager that you can use as a guide for completing forms. You can also use the mapping document when drafting the form and when discussing the form with the student. This document provides an approximate indication of when each proficiency should be achieved. So each proficiency is indicated by an N, a Y, or a C. So where there's an N, that's where progress but no proficiency is expected. So students should be progressing, but we don't expect them to be performing at the standard, the week 14 standard, which is effectively to the standard of a qualified dietitian. With the Y, this is where the student would be expected to achieve the proficiency at some point within the range of weeks indicated. So they don't have to achieve the proficiency by the first week, but if they haven't achieved the proficiency by the final week indicated, a review of progress is needed. And the C is what indicates that the student should hopefully be continuing to hold the yes. They should maintain the proficiency. So this document can be used when discussing assessment forms with the student, and it helps to identify those areas where a review of progress is needed, and those areas where there's no concern. So alongside the assessment form, the midpoint review must also be completed at some point between week 6 and 8, and it's a very straightforward 1 to 2 pager that just helps to ensure that all parties, the student coordinator and tutor, are on the same page regarding how the student is performing. It enables the practice tutor to record their views on student progress, and it's an opportunity for the student to ask any questions. So it's just that additional safety net alongside the assessment forms to ensure that students are progressing as they should, or that areas that are proving challenging have been identified and are being addressed. So that's the assessment form, mapping document and midpoint review. If you have any questions on this aspect of placement, please don't hesitate to contact us here. And thanks very much for listening.